Welcome to part 2 of Digital Foundry's Red Dead Redemption 2 coverage. For this video, we're going to do things a little differently from part 1 by discussing our findings and comparing all the different console versions of the game against one another. And to do that, I am joined by my friend and colleague, Richard Ledbetter.
Hey John, how's it all going?
It is going wonderful. I've had a great week playing Red Dead 2, and it's really nice to be able to talk about it at last.
So let's talk a little about part 1 of the video. I mean, I'm going into this one completely raw. I've seen I haven't barely seen anything, to be honest with you. So what is the sort of key point we want to communicate to our users about the kind of achievement this game represents?
Yeah, so obviously there's a lot of hype behind that, so there's going to be some skepticism there, and I was skeptical going into it. I thought the trailers looked great, but when you actually sit down and you start walking through the scenery and you see what they've done, I kind of feel like they undersold what they've managed to achieve here. This is a very, very impressive looking open world game. And this is the generation of open world games. We've seen a lot of beautiful ones. I mean, Assassin's Creed looks great. Witcher 3 looks excellent. You know, there's a lot of others out there, but I feel like this is probably the most impressive one next to, say, like Horizon Zero Dawn that I've seen in action. And I think this actually feels like one step above that in many ways. There's a level of granularity on display with everything. Like, they're using Euphoria again for the animation. There's a lot of like this impressive animation work going on in there. Everything interacts, the physics between things, the new PBR material system, the global illumination that they've introduced. It all just really works super well together. And I think, as we'll find out, certain versions of the game are perhaps the most impressive showings we've seen for this style of game yet this generation.
This is an interesting one, isn't it? Because all of the pre-release marketing material has been, well, initially started on the base PlayStation 4 version of the game, and then towards the end we started to get gameplay videos which were running presumably on PlayStation 4 Pro. So we've seen nothing at all on Xbox, which I find quite fascinating, and I think it's been quite remarkable actually to sort of get to see those two versions of the game and to see just how those two systems cope with this magnificent technical achievement.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's refresh then the PlayStation versions first. So the base PS4 version, it's 1080p. The PS4 Pro version, a little more complex. They are using what appears to be some sort of reconstruction technique. I'm not sure necessarily if it's checkerboarding or however they're pulling it off, but it's reconstructing from essentially a 1920 by 2160 image. And the implementation here is not the best I've seen. It sort of gives it this double edge, double striped look on parts of the scene, and especially on foliage. But they try to make up for it with the new temporal anti-aliasing, which shines in higher resolutions, but not so much at lower resolutions, which is where I think the base Xbox One comes in. And the base Xbox One version is it's 864p. And it's really blurry thanks to the TAA. It's specifically the mix of that low resolution with their temporal anti-aliasing solution that creates a really blurry image. And we'll talk a little bit more about other temporal aspects of the image, but needless to say, it's blurry. But on the other end of the spectrum, we have Xbox One X, which, as I mentioned in part 1, it's actually native 4K.
Yeah, that is quite remarkable, isn't it? If we consider the scalability there, I think it's like 6.2 times an increase in resolution from the S to the X, which might be unprecedented. And as we shall discover, it's not just the resolution that's improved.
Yeah, exactly.
So, you know, I have to admit, the first time I loaded up the game was on the X, and I literally just went straight into your save game. And I was just blown away by the resolution. I mean, you do get the value from the pixels here, particularly on materials, on the main character there.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the main areas, is all the little texture detail and everything. Like, you can see the fibers in his shirt and, you know, just the wood grain and everything. And the game has a lot of fine detail up close, but also at a distance. There's a lot of heavy foliage, for instance. And I found, like, here on the base Xbox One, for instance, the trees just kind of turn to mush at a distance, whereas, you know, at native 4K here, they look super sharp, and you can really sort of appreciate all the branches and leaves on each tree. And same with things like the parallax occlusion maps, and there's a lot of granular detail in here, both near and far, and it definitely benefits from that extra resolution. That's not to say that the resolution on the Pro is bad, though. Like, it definitely is a much softer game on the PS4 Pro, I think, and I've seen many other examples of checkerboard rendering that were far more successful than this in terms of resolving a really clean image. Like, I think Horizon looks a lot cleaner than this. The Tomb Raider games, well, Rise of the Tomb Raider has that checkerboard 4K mode. It's like razor sharp. This is not that, but it's not bad. But it's just really, this really shows what you can do with native 4K and a nice TAA.
Yeah, so let's talk about the TAA, because it's one of these games similar to, I guess the last one we looked at was Spider-Man, where on a camera cut you can actually see the native resolution, and this allows us to break out our pixel counting technique and actually get a decent lock on what each title is doing. So this was surprising on the Pro, especially because on the trailer materials we didn't have those scene cuts, and it seemed to be resolving at 1920 by 2160 native, half resolution, half 4K, but it does seem to be doing something more here.
Yeah, that's right. So it seems to be sort of jittering together those two frames in a way to create something that, in some scenes at least, does appear to almost resolve to 4K. Like, there's instances where it can pass for it, but I found during general gameplay, especially with a lot of alpha transparency on screen, there's a lot of trees in the game, so it's constant. They really do have that, it looks almost like a nearest neighbor scale, where there's like a double edge to things, or things are just, they're sharp, but chunkier looking, and it's very strange, actually. It's not a look I've seen often on the Pro. So, I mean, it does... The thing, though, is I feel like they're using this TAA to help with a lot of things. Like, with their SSR pass, with the way that they handle the volumetric clouds and the light shafts and the shadows. All of this, when you do the scene cut, it's very grainy looking. And the lower the resolution, the grainier it appears. And then the TAA sort of tries to make up for it somewhat. And, you know, it works really well on the Pro and the X, a little less well on the base PS4, but on the base Xbox One, I mean, you look at the shadows here and it's just, it's kind of a dithered mess, I have to admit.
Yeah, I have to admit, I've seen your assets for the base Xbox. It's a bit of a problem. I mean, it could well hold up in a, you know, sort of living room environment with, you know, where you're quite a way away from the screen. But, you know, when you look side by side, it's a different world almost.
Yeah, and okay, I don't want to be too harsh on this, because yes, the image quality takes a massive hit on that console. But when you actually look at the overall image, they've retained a lot between the versions. I didn't really notice much in the way of, say, like reduced LODs, for instance, and then like general level of detail. It seems to actually be consistent across all 4 versions of the game, with the exception of textures, I think, and this one's actually rather subtle. So there does appear to be a higher resolution texture pack in effect, and it does seem to apply to both the Xbox One X and the PS4 Pro. But the base systems definitely, if you look at character close-ups, you see lower resolution materials on the clothing and the faces. There is some confusion around the install sizes, though. The PS4 version is 98 gigs on both systems, but currently on my Xbox One X and S, it comes in at 106 gigabytes. Yet the original install when I was downloading it said 88 gigabytes or so. It does, however, say that Durango and Scorpio assets are available, so it does kind of suggest that there are extra textures just for Xbox One X. But honestly, with the way the resolution impacts the texture detail, it's a little bit difficult to say for sure that there are enhanced textures here. Like, I think there is. The base machines really do seem to have reduced texture detail. You can see the texels changing when swapping between them, but it's not really a night and day difference kind of thing. Now, one other weird thing I noticed. At first glance, I actually thought that the X had higher resolution textures than the Pro on characters. But when you look really closely, I'm not sure that's the case. So if you do the frame change trick here and we sort of freeze it, these textures mostly do look sharper on the X, but there's this one spot here you'll notice that the full image is resolved and the texture appears to be identical between the two. So I started paying close attention to that sort of thing, and it seems that overall it's really that it's the checkerboard rendering that's sort of destroying texture detail on the Pro. So I think they're the same assets, but you lose some texture detail on the Pro due to the lower resolution. This cutscene also kind of revealed a difference in the way ambient occlusion and basic shading on the characters is handled. So there's a pretty big difference between the X version and the base Xbox One in terms of how the character's shaded. I think it looks a lot more refined on the X. And if we compare the Pro to the base PS4 though, they look slightly different but very similar. They're closer to the X. Now if we compare the X to the Pro though, I still think the X has a slight advantage here, but nowhere near as much as the base system. So it basically seems like X has the most refined ambient occlusion. The Pro and the PS4 are a little below that and very similar, and then the base Xbox One falls well below that. Oh, and rewinding to the X versus base comparison, you also notice that the depth of field is tied to rendering resolution, so the lower your resolution, the shallower the effect gets. So I guess you could jokingly say that the game is more cinematic on the Xbox One base, though there's a second part to that we'll discuss when we get to performance.
But I guess from my perception of the initial sort of trailer assets was that the consistency in the open world, the lack of pop-in particular was noteworthy. It really gave a real sort of sense of total consistency in the world. And does that apply to all versions of the game?
Yes, it does in general. I mean, it's true the trees and grass, they kind of look a little pasty on the lower res consoles, but there's not that much visible pop-in. If you look carefully, you'll see it. But I think this is a matter of the artists and the engine guys working very closely to kind of ensure that it's never jarring. It's really very convincing. The stuff in the distance, the really distant LODs, they place just enough foliage around in strategic areas that it still seems like it's full of detail. And the actual draw-in distance is fairly far from the player on all versions. So it has this very natural, gradual sort of feeling as you move across the terrain. It's very, very nice. And this is also true in the city environments as well. And the city here I actually thought was one of the most impressive areas in the game, and something we didn't see much of in the trailers. It's just, it kind of reminds me of what they were trying to do with Assassin's Creed Unity, but even more detailed perhaps. Though it's not necessarily that big, but it's still large. But just the combination of the volumetric effects, the lighting, the materials, like there's just copious amounts of parallax occlusion maps everywhere. It's super, super detailed, and it looks amazing on all platforms, which really impressed me.
Okay, so we talked about the resolution and how it's important to the overall look of the game and the ramifications that it has. But other elements of the visual feature set, are we looking at parity there, or are there differences?
Yeah, in general, aside from the texture stuff, I do feel that they're roughly identical. If there are differences, they're quite subtle. Based on my own comparisons though, running a lot of side-by-side footage and flipping between different clips, it really does seem to be on par across all four versions. Like they really wanted to maintain that consistency there.
Wow, even shadows and stuff like that?
Yeah, the shadows, they do appear pretty much the same. The main issue there is that they're really dithered on the lower end consoles, especially on the base Xbox One. So it does give the impression of them looking worse overall, but I'm not so sure that the shadows took a big hit. It's really just the way that they're filtered that suffers.
Okay, and let's move on, I guess, to the big one, which is performance.
Yes,
So how does this all shake out?
This one is very interesting, right? So I kind of feel like we should talk a little bit about the X versus the base Xbox One first, because we've already mentioned the huge leap in resolution right there. Like, it's already a much larger gap between the two than the usual game. And this also holds true with performance. So I found that the experience on Xbox One X is far more stable than I ever expected. It is a very, very stable game. In fact, I can only recall maybe 3 or 4 times total where I actually noticed any frame drops at all during gameplay. Once here, there's this cutscene that I noticed where, you know, the frame rate actually did drop pretty hard, and it did surprise me because it's such a rare thing, but, well, there it is. And then, you know, just a few other little misses here and there, but in general, it's a very stable 30 FPS. then you swap over and you look at the base Xbox One, and it's not good. So walking around the normal terrain, that actually is pretty okay. It does seem to handle the large open spaces fairly well. But then I went into this first town here, or one of the early towns in the game, Valentine, and it's not terrible, but you're already starting to see the console struggle a little bit. There's some dropped frames here. It doesn't feel quite as fluid as you would have expected, which definitely made me wonder about the later sections, which is where I went to next. When you get to Saint-Denis, it's immediately obvious that the poor base Xbox One just can't quite cope, and we're looking at a frame rate that kind of hangs around, I'd say 26 to 28 FPS on average. So for this scene, I'm just running right through the center of town. This is one of the busiest kind of sections, you know, especially with all the trees and the building facades and crowds around, and the frame rate's just sitting below 30 basically. Whereas on Xbox One X, it has absolutely no trouble at all blasting through this. Super stable frame rate, really impressive result there. And so that's kind of the general run then. So I'd actually say that on base Xbox One, technically speaking, it runs better than just about every other previous Rockstar release in its original form. Like, you compare this to like GTA 4 or 5 on the 360 and PS3, or you go back to the PS2 generation, or even Red Dead 1, it's smoother than all of them. So it's not to say it's terrible, but then when you compare it to the upper end consoles, you can really see that, okay, they were obviously having some struggles there on that system. And I wanted to look at a couple other scenes as well. So there's this fight that happens here at the saloon, and you get knocked outside into the rain and sort of engage in a fist fight in the mud. And the frame rate on the base Xbox One does start to tank, just like we saw in the city actually, and it's not that great. But this is also kind of a challenging scene in general, since I found that all of the consoles exhibited some issues here. But really, it's this cutscene afterward that's so peculiar. So we're looking at it on the base Xbox One here, and yeah, the performance is dipping again, which is kind of, you know, in line with what we've seen from the base Xbox One thus far. It's kind of hanging under 30, in that sort of mid-range level. I think the lowest in the scene is about 25 or 24, something like that. But what's interesting is that if you switch back to the Xbox One X, which runs just about everything else in the game that I've seen thus far at a locked 30, including every other cutscene, there's just something about this scene that just destroys performance, and the X actually turns in, I think, a lower frame rate for the scene than the base system, and in fact lower than all the other consoles just in this one scene. So I'm thinking it's something to do with the mix of the volumetrics and the depth of field and all the different character models and the rain and everything coming together in just such a way that the performance kind of drops here at this native 4K resolution. Now, I've really tried to avoid spoilers in this review, but I've played a lot further than this in the main story and seen a lot of cutscenes. And on the X, this really is the only one that I really noticed that had any performance problems at all. But we'll look at the PlayStation versions as well in this specific scene a bit later. But the main takeaway on the Xbox side is that the base Xbox One doesn't fare that well. It's not bad. It's better than old Rockstar games, but it's not optimal. There's still plenty of slowdown throughout, though the open fields are pretty okay. The Xbox One X, though, it turns in, I'd say, it's a very stable level of performance, extremely consistent in just about every scene you can imagine, including the busy city areas. So when you take into account the massive leap in resolution, the performance on the X is really impressive.
Yeah, it's fair enough. And let's move on to the PlayStations then, because, well, in theory, they should be the lead platform because the market leadership is there. So you would expect those to get, pretty decent level of care and attention there. So how's that shaping up?
All right then. Well, let's start with the Pro. Now, performance in general, pretty good here. Out in the countryside and the little towns, it's pretty smooth overall. In fact, I'd say during traversal, it's pretty much a locked 30 FPS, a lot like the Xbox One X. But when I wandered into Valentine here, I did see some drops just below 30 FPS, which was a little bit surprising actually, considering the resolution difference between this and X. And while we're talking about Valentine, I should probably also talk about the saloon fight and the cutscene after it. So, When you're engaged in the fist fight here, again, the performance is a little slower than the X with some slight dips below 30 FPS, but it's definitely faster than what we saw on the base Xbox One, as you would expect. There were a few little dips here and there on the X as well, but it's definitely a little slower on the Pro. And then the following cutscene, that also exhibits drops just like the other two versions, though it doesn't actually seem to drop as low as it did on the X. So that's an interesting one. This is the one scene, the only scene I've encountered that the X actually drops below the other versions. Very strange, but it's not great either way. Then there's the town section, and this is the one that's really sort of pushing all the systems, except for X, which runs quite well. Running up through the middle of the street here on the Pro, in this busy section here, we see frame rate kind of hanging just below 30 FPS. It's sort of in the 28 to 29 frames per second range most of the time. It's perfectly playable, but it's definitely disappointing to me considering that it's pretty much a locked 30 FPS on the X here, with just a few skipped frames here and there. But it's worth keeping in mind that this whole area here in Saint-Denis is pretty much the most demanding section I found, besides that one crazy cutscene that destroys all the consoles. So the Pro is pretty good overall, I'd say. In general performance, you are looking at a stable 30 FPS. It's just that when you get to some of the busier areas like this, you're gonna get a few drops. Overall, I'd say this is comparable to something like the GTA 5 release on PS4. So it's good, but it doesn't run as well as Xbox One X overall.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because, basically the Xbox One X is, 40% more powerful in terms of compute. And once again, we've got this huge gulf in resolution and extra stability.
Yeah, it's quite surprising. I mean, I have to say that in terms of all the titles we've looked at, this might be the best case I've seen yet for the Xbox One X. It really is a super impressive version of the game. But we can't not talk about the base PS4, of course. First impressions are pretty positive. The image quality does look a lot better than the base Xbox One. And riding around in the fields and sort of these open areas again, it's very stable. But it was pretty good on Xbox One as well. But once you get into this first town, Valentine again, we start to see the telltale problems. And in fact, the frame rate here is a little bit lower than what I saw on the S. But then again, it's a variable kind of town. Then there's the cutscene, which we looked at on all the other versions. The infamous one after the saloon brawl, which kind of runs pretty bad on every system, and the PS4 base is the same. It just kind of hangs around the mid-20s most of the time, sometimes dipping below 25 FPS. Again, though, the Xbox One X is the worst performing version in this one scene, and it's so weird. This is the only scene where it's like that, but there it is. And then, of course, we have Saint-Denis, which is the biggest test for the game across every platform. And, the X does really well here. The Pro isn't too bad, but the base Xbox One is pretty sluggish. And so is the base PS4. In fact, in some ways, I might say the base PS4 is worse, or at least it's very comparable to what we see on the base Xbox One. Running up the hill here in the trees, it's exactly as we saw on Xbox One S. It's just not running that well. It's not terrible, but it's definitely under 30 pretty much the whole time. But there is one other area that really stuck out to me here that I wanted to look at across all four platforms, and it's a little bit later in the city when you're running back towards the train station. Okay, so let's start with the best version, which again, it's Xbox One X, no surprise. In fact, this little sequence here, there is exactly one duplicate frame that pops up during this run. Otherwise, it's a flat 30. Then on the PS4 Pro, it's close to being 30, but it does dip a little bit below, kind of hanging around the 29 range. Again, just a few duplicate frames here and there. Still pretty okay, though. These two are fine. Then we come to the base Xbox One, and this runs similarly to what we saw in the center of the city, and possibly even a little worse, kind of hitting that 25-26 range. It's not good. But the base PS4 actually drops lower here with a low frame rate of 23 frames per second. So yeah, I was kind of surprised by this actually. The base system really isn't doing that great in Saint-Denis here. But I guess, as I said, with the base Xbox One, it's kind of the same situation where the overall average performance is better than most of Rockstar's previous games when they were new, save for the GTA 5 release this generation. But so, you know, I don't think people are going to have a huge issue with the performance there, but it is surprising to see that it drops essentially to Assassin's Creed Unity kind of territory in a way, though it's not nearly as sustained as that, and it doesn't have those kind of bugs and other issues. Again, though, I do want to stress the sort of caveat that always comes with these frame rate tests. I mean, a lot of this stuff was focused on the trouble spots, but again, all versions do pretty well when you're just in sort of the open field. So I think the average experience is good on every platform, but these difficult spots definitely start to struggle on the lower machines. But really, I mean, you know, it is what it is. It's, you know, you get the better performance on the more powerful consoles, but it's, you know, overall, I think they did a pretty good job releasing a game across all these different consoles, especially one of this scale. We're seeing a lot of these big games brought over from developers across all these systems, and getting to this level across every platform is not an easy thing. And even the base Xbox One experience, it's quite reasonable. But I'm really impressed with what they did for the upper end consoles on this one, and the game itself just looks phenomenal. I mean, I sound like I'm just going crazy like with hype or something, but I wasn't even that hyped for this. It's just when you actually see, if you're really into graphics and you see what they're doing here with the lighting and everything, it's really something else. This is an impressive release.
Yeah, I've got to admit, when I went straight into your save game on Xbox One X, that initial visual hit, it was like, you know, you're definitely right there. The trailers, they were holding so much back. Just this one scene from within the city was just amazing.
Yeah.
It's quite remarkable. And I think from Microsoft's perspective as well, I think the marketing deals are all tied in with Sony, which may be why we've seen PS4 and Pro footage to date. But Microsoft are onto something really special here, and I expect them to be pushing this quite aggressively because it is an absolute showcase for the system.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, John, I think we've covered pretty much everything there, but let's wrap this up. Let's have a summary.
Yeah, so basically, game looks great across every version. Best version is definitely Xbox One X. PS4 Pro is right behind it. The base Xbox One and PS4 versions, though, they're definitely worse overall, I'd say. I mean, the resolution, especially on Xbox One S, it's pretty low, but you know, again, compared to older Rockstar titles, it does kind of hold up. It's not that bad at all. And I think they did a reasonable job squeezing a game this beautiful and huge out of those consoles. And if you want to see more about the detail that went into the world and you haven't watched it, definitely check out part 1, where I kind of do my typical, somewhat cinematic breakdown. You know, I kind of enjoy making those videos like that, sort of feature videos. And we decided to split this one up just so that if you're just looking for this data and you're trying to figure out which version to go for, well, here it is. And my suggestion really is, if you got an Xbox One X, get that version. If you got a Pro, obviously, you know, if you have a Pro and an X, I'd still say the X, but if you don't, the Pro version's good as well. And if you're trying to decide between the others, I mean, the base PS4 is definitely the better of those two.
Good stuff. Anything else before we wrap this one up?
I think that's really just about it. You know, I had a great time with the game. I was really impressed by it. You know, it has a very slow start, I'd say. The first couple hours are very slow. It's kind of a tutorial build up to sort of show you how the game works, and I can see why that's there. But my initial impression was like, this is beautiful, but I'm not blown away. But over time, it really does start to ratchet up, and I think it's a good follow-up to Red Dead Redemption. But yeah, that's pretty much it. And so I think thanks for joining me on this little chat, Rich.
No problem at all.
It's just kind of a little scattered thing, but hopefully this gives you a better idea of, you know, my experiences playing the game on multiple platforms. And of course, if you did enjoy this video, as always, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. Ring the notification bell up top to get all the latest information from Digital Foundry, and follow us over on Twitter. And until next time, this is John and Rich signing off.